There's a common assumption we make when we watch a complex organization, a market, or even a government collapse. We tend to assume that the failure happened simply because the system was blind. We think decision makers just didn't have enough information to see the disaster coming, and that if they just had more data, the whole thing could have been easily avoided. But when we actually look at the historical record of these massive failures, we hit an immediate contradiction. Complex systems rarely starve for information. In fact, at the exact moment a system is driving straight toward collapse, it's usually surrounded by clear, abundant warning signs. The data is right there. The warnings are loud. So the presence of information doesn't prevent the failure. Instead, we're looking at an unseen structural force at work. Complex systems don't just passively miss vital signals. They actively filter them out. They systematically destroy new, contradictory information to maintain their own underlying design. To understand how a system learns to perfectly ignore reality, we really have to look at the mechanics of efficiency.
Part 1. The cost of efficiency. Imagine a heavy, wooden cart moving across a completely flat dirt plain. The cart has a destination in mind, but there's no paved road to get there.
As the cart rolls across the dirt, its immense weight compresses the earth right beneath its wheels. A very shallow rut starts to form. The next time the cart crosses the plain, it naturally settles into this slight depression, simply because it takes less energy than rolling over fresh, uncompressed dirt. With every subsequent pass, the weight of the cart compacts the soil a bit further. The rut becomes a trench. Soon, the wheels are locked in. The cart can't turn anymore. It's forced to travel along a predetermined path. Human organizations operate the exact same way. They possess bounded rational capacity. They literally cannot process every single piece of information or negotiate every action from scratch. So, to save precious cognitive resources and attention, organizations push daily, repetitive decisions into semi-conscious mechanisms. They develop standard rules and repetitive behaviors just to coordinate collective action.
We call these efficiency mechanisms organizational routines. On the surface, routines act as procedural memory. They allow a group to function smoothly, creating a sort of structural truce that minimizes daily conflict over how things should be done. But here's the catch. In optimizing for efficiency, the system has quietly begun the invisible process of limiting its alternatives.
Part 2. Filtering the signals. As the routine really takes hold, the cart's trench deepens. Moving forward is completely effortless now, but any deviation from the established route requires an immense, almost impossible expenditure of energy. The system is no longer just optimizing, it's filtering.
When the environment changes and a new problem arises, the system has to search for a solution. But it doesn't search objectively. Organizational learning theory shows us that search rules adapt based on previous success. The system will only look for solutions in the exact places where it successfully looked before. It begins to expect certain outcomes based entirely on its deep historical baseline. When completely new, objective evidence is presented to the system, a really strange conversion happens. That new evidence is run through the subjective memory of the organization. Because the system's memory is noisy and heavily weighted toward its past routines, the objective facts are smoothed out, they're diminished. The system observes an absolute certainty, but internally it registers it as a minor, easily dismissible probability. This structural lag is known as conservatism bias. It's a mathematical reality of belief revision, where the prior distribution, the history of the system, is vastly overweighed and the new sample evidence is vastly underweighed. The system is structurally incapable of updating its internal map to match the external territory. Before we continue, if you're looking for a calmer way to process the overwhelming amount of daily information in our own environment, you might consider Sift. It's a news app designed to highlight only the most important updates, entirely removing those endless headlines and sensational content. You can find it through the link in the description. Now, returning to our analysis. Part 3. The architecture of rejection. The system is now rolling deeply within its trench. But what happens when the external signals become so loud and so contradictory that they can no longer be simply smoothed over by historical noise? The system escalates. It shifts from passively ignoring data to actively defending its path. When MRI scans are used to observe how the human brain processes heavily dissonant information, facts that directly contradict deeply held structural beliefs, we don't see the activation of logical reasoning centers. Instead, the emotional centers of the brain flare up.
The system perceives the new data not as information, but as a literal threat. It actively fights the new data to reduce the severe cognitive dissonance it causes.
The consequences of this defense mechanism are entirely irrational. In a famous Stanford experiment, individuals with strong opinions on capital punishment were given mixed, detailed evidence. Some supported their view, some opposed it. Logically, exposure to mixed evidence should moderate extreme beliefs, but instead, individuals used the evidence to irrationally double down. They set impossibly high standards for the opposing data and accepted the confirming data without question. They actually left the experiment with more extreme beliefs than they started with.
This defense mechanism is so potent that it doesn't even require ambiguous data to function. It can survive the complete destruction of its own evidential base. Back in 1954, researchers embedded themselves in a doomsday cult whose members had predicted the exact date the world would end. When the date arrived and the prophecy entirely failed, the system didn't collapse. The failure actually bolstered the group's internal conviction. They simply rewrote their reality to justify their past actions.
This active filtration is confirmation bias. It acts as an automatic, unintentional editing process. It operates continuously in the background, making sure the system only sees what it already expects to see and neutralizes absolutely anything that demands a change in direction.
Part 4. Irreversible lock-in. The cart is now entirely trapped. The trench is so deep and the walls are so high that the wheels cannot be turned. Even if the passengers can clearly see a cliff approaching on the horizon, the momentum and the structure of the earth below them dictate their trajectory.
We see this strict physical constraint in our own technological and institutional realities. Just consider legacy systems. The QWERT keyboard layout was originally designed for mechanical typewriters to prevent physical keys from jamming. We no longer use mechanical typewriters, yet the layout persists on every digital screen. Software code requires backward compatibility, forcing future innovations to conform entirely to the limitations of past generations.
What began as a minor, rational efficiency, a slight compression of the dirt to save energy, a specific keyboard layout to stop metal bars from colliding, aggregates over time. Through positive feedback loops and increasing returns, these small, early differences amplify into massive, disproportionate constraints. The system achieves a state of extreme stability, which, paradoxically, is also a state of extreme fragility.
This ultimate mechanism is path dependence. It's the phenomenon where a sequence of logical, local efficiencies eventually creates an absorbing state with no real exit. The system is no longer making choices based on current reality. It's merely executing the predetermined logic of its history.
Part 5. The inevitable outcome. The physical constraints of motion and the institutional reality of human organizations bring us to a single, inescapable conclusion about why complex systems collapse in plain sight. When a system optimizes perfectly for its environment, it trades adaptability for efficiency. It digs its trench. The subsequent inability to process new, vital information, the filtering, the conservatism, the confirmation bias, the path dependence, isn't a glitch. It's not a flaw in the system's execution. It is the perfected result of its design.
The system was never failing. It was following its structure.